2 years ago, if Mike had come across our office and was saying, listen, I want to do a big round at a big valuation, we would have laughed and thrown him out. And literally it would have ended almost immediately. It's almost completely flipped 180 now. And I'm not sure I ever heard how much he was asking for if he was, but if he came in and was asking for anything less than 10, now I might think that's too small.
Welcome to Cleantech Forward, a Foresight podcast where we explore clean tech customers, capital, and Canada's path to net zero. Tune in to learn more about Canada's most exciting clean tech startups, industry success stories, investor insights, and academic initiatives as we accelerate the growth and impact of clean tech together.
Welcome back to Cleantech Forward. My name is Jeanette Jackson, CEO of Foresight Canada. Today we're doing something a little different. Mike Kelland, CEO of Planetary Hydrogen, is pitching his technology to carbonNEXT Director Jason Switzer, Marty Reed of Evok Innovations, and Carly Anderson of Prime Movers Lab. Planetary Hydrogen is a Nova Scotia-based company working on technology that allows them to produce hydrogen via the conventional electrolysis of water. This is a unique opportunity to hear a clean tech founder pitch and get immediate feedback from investors. No dragons in this den, just constructive feedback. Following Mike's pitch, the panel of investors will offer some feedback, talk to Mike about his company, and the finer points of pitching to investors. Enjoy the show. This Cleantech Forward podcast is supported by Gowling WLG. A global leader in intellectual property law, Gowling WLG works alongside Canadian clean tech companies to develop IP strategies that maximize business opportunities and increase market share while protecting valuable innovation. From idea to investment to international expansion, Gowling WLG understands the potential of your intellectual property at every stage of growth. Visit gowlingwlg.com/cleantech to learn how they can support your business today.
Welcome. I'm Jason Switzer. I'm the Vice President for Growth and Capital at Foresight Cleantech Accelerator Canada. And it's a real pleasure to kick off this new podcast with my partner in crime, Marty Reed of Evok Innovations. Marty?
Jason, thanks. Marty Reed, founder of Evok Innovations, and certainly excited to be here. Longtime energy and climate investor and sort of a fervent consumer of podcasts, including some that you've been a part of for many years, Jason. So glad to be teaming up with you on this. And also excited to have a guest with us today who I've known for some time and think quite highly of, who comes out of Silicon Valley and is deep on the tech side. And so with that, would love to introduce our guest today, Carly Anderson.
Well, thanks, Marty. Hey, everyone. My name is Carly Anderson. I'm a chemical engineer and partner at Prime Movers Lab, which is a breakthrough science venture firm headquartered in Jackson, Wyoming, although I sit out here, like you said, in Silicon Valley. So great to be here.
And welcoming Mike Kelland, CEO of Planetary Hydrogen. Mike, we're thrilled to have you here. Why don't you tell us about your company?
Yeah, Jason, thanks so much. And I'm really happy to be on the podcast and talk a little bit about Planetary Hydrogen. So as you mentioned, I'm the CEO at Planetary Hydrogen. And just to walk quickly into what we're doing as a company, I often talk about climate change as being a massive challenge, but what's interesting is that repairing climate change is an opportunity, and it's a huge opportunity. So in order to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to do two things. First, we need to radically reduce emissions, and second, we need to permanently remove hundreds to thousands of gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the market for those removals is pretty small today, but it has the potential to scale to over 50 billion by 2030 and up to $1 trillion by 2050 as the world looks to permanently remove as much as 10 gigatons of CO2 per year at an average price of $100 a ton. Our technology enhances and accelerates the most powerful carbon removal process on Earth. So in nature, you get rain coming down and it absorbs CO2 out of the air, and that creates a mild acid. And as that mild acid falls on rocks around the world, it weathers the top layer and forms bicarbonates. Eventually, all those bicarbonates sort of flow out and make their way out to the ocean. And once there, they remain dissolved in ocean chemistry for hundreds of thousands of years. And so that's like a natural process that will solve climate change over the next sort of 100,000 years. And of course, the challenge is we don't really have 100,000 years to solve climate change. So our system, our technology essentially speeds that process up. One of the main reasons this is so powerful is that the oceans are where the carbon is sort of naturally stored on Earth. So 88% of the carbon on the Earth's surface is stored in ocean chemistry. And if we were to take all the carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the oceans with our process, we would only increase that by about 2%. So our technology is big for humanity. It makes a massive impact on the climate, but the additional carbon will be almost imperceptible in our oceans. So our technology has two big major components. The first one is what we call our green system, which is an electrochemical plant located at a mine site. That system's primary goal is to convert mine waste into hydrogen and a mild form of alkalinity. And as a benefit to the mine where it's located, that process reduces the carbon footprint of remediating mine waste and produces hydrogen that can be used in mine vehicles to decarbonize their operations. The resulting product out of that process, though, is a mild solid form of alkalinity, which we then transport to the coast to put into the other half of our process, which is what we call our blue system. And in that blue system, we use existing permitted ocean outfalls to add that alkalinity into seawater. And when we do that, it enhances the ocean's ability to take up CO2 out of the atmosphere and stores it safely within that ocean chemistry for hundreds of thousands of years. So we see this business sort of developing in 4 distinct phases over the next 15 years or so. And as we develop this out, and we have 2 key clients out of that development. One is the mine operator, and the other one is carbon removal purchasers, both compliance markets and voluntary markets. Ultimately, at very high scale, we envision that the technology will be removing a gigaton of CO2 per year and supplying lower carbon negative hydrogen to global fuels markets. So that's sort of the end goal, but we've got a ways to go before we get there. So I'll walk through those 4 generations because I think they give a sense for how this business develops and what it's going to look like over sort of the next, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. In generation 1, we're really focused on building out a monitoring, reporting, and verification framework for carbon removal based on real world data from our ocean carbon process. And so basically what we do is we just buy alkalinity. We're not doing any kind of electrochemistry or anything like that in the first phase. We're just buying this alkalinity and we're putting it in the ocean in order to prove out that carbon removal. And our real goal with that is to deliver our committed tonnage. So we've already sold all of the sort of initial carbon removals to Shopify. So we want to deliver that initial tonnage and solidify our partnership with the outfall operators and the research organizations that are going to bring this ocean alkalinity enhancement process forward. That process is quite expensive for carbon removal because when we buy this stuff on the open market, the alkalinity has a very high carbon footprint in its creation. So the net removal is actually quite low of every ton of say, alkalinity that we purchase and put into the ocean. So that's why in the second generation, we have to start producing our own alkalinity. So we've got 2 pilot sites that we've started up already, and these sites are currently being developed in partnership with the mine operators. Generation 2 is all about sort of developing our supply of low carbon alkalinity and proving that our electrochemical system works as we expect up to about 1,000 tons per year of CO2 removal. In generation 2, we will split the product, which consists of that electrochemical cell and process and unit operations, away from what we call the project, which is focused on the specific mineral at the mine. And in doing that, that'll allow us to quickly replicate this process at a variety of mine sites around the world. And that's when we get into generation 3. So in generation 3, we really scale up and expand to multiple mine operations. And the distinguishing factor of this generation of our business is that scale is sufficient at up to about 200,000 tons of CO2 per site annually. And that provides really strong decarbonization benefits to our mining clients through waste remediation and hydrogen. But it doesn't yet provide enough hydrogen to justify transporting it off-site. And so really we're focused on mines in this generation, and this probably runs us out to, sort of close to the end of the decade, sort of 2026 to 2029 kind of timeframe. And the key selling point of this is that this is a fairly simple system for mine decarbonization with a carbon removal offtake revenue portion. So it's simplistic in terms of how it works. And it should be able to yield for mine sites an IRR of about 25% or greater, depending on the mineral that we're using and the mine operation that we're getting into. Then we get into full scale. So when we get into sort of generation 4, we're expecting to be producing enough hydrogen to generate carbon negative fuel, and we're moving from the voluntary carbon market into the fuels compliance markets. And at this scale, many worldwide operations that are each producing up to 1 million tons a year of CO2 removal and providing significant quantities of hydrogen. The hydrogen produced can either be processed on site to something like methanol or ammonia, or transported to a refiner. And at this point, projects will typically be funded by compliance markets in the fuel space, providing significantly higher revenues. So that's pretty much the business. Our ambition is to remove a gigaton of CO2 per year by 2035. That's where we want to be. It's huge. It's a massive ambition. We know that's really big. It's not something we're going to be able to do by ourselves. So we've secured partnerships with mines, ocean outfalls, carbon removal purchasers, universities, NGOs, technical contractors, suppliers, and we're supported by key advisors like Lisa DeMarco, Pat Foodie, Yvonne Champagne. And finally, we've assembled a really rock solid team of scientists, engineers, and business leaders. And we know we're going to need a lot more than that to achieve our big goals. So our current plan is to raise a Series A next year that'll take us from Gen 2 to Gen 3 of the business model. So that's us, that's our business. And I'm happy to take questions and go into it from there.
That was fantastic, Mike. Thanks again for that great pitch. I really like how you laid out the different sections for me very clearly in terms of what is the opportunity, what is the solution, what is the path and the roadmap, and then who are the customers. One of the questions I wanted to lead off with is on the validation side of things. So what are you seeing around who's going to provide that service? Do we have to wait for that market to mature? How are you viewing that?
Yes, it's a great question. So the form of carbon removal that we're doing is called ocean alkalinity enhancement, and it's a relatively new field. One of the challenges with carbon removal out of the ocean in this way is that when we add this alkalinity into the ocean, it very rapidly dilutes. The ocean's a big place. There's only so much you can put in it at one time, and it very rapidly dilutes. The time frame for the actual removals to happen are fairly long after that dilution effect happens. So where the alkalinity gets added and where the carbon actually gets captured and sequestered could be tens to hundreds of kilometers away from each other. And it could be as far as a year apart from each other. And it's not going to be able to be recognized on instruments very, very easily. And so essentially what we talk about when we talk about a framework for verifying that carbon removed, it's going to be a combination of lab-based and closed system-based studies that can show the kinetics and show how all of this sort of stuff develops and how that captured carbon actually happens, and some real world modeling with various different flows and things like that in the region that things go out to. And so this is really it's a big deal in the OAE space. It's one of the big activities that we're working on. And there's a lot of people working on this together. We're bringing together scientists and government and private companies and ourselves in a lot of different ways in order to create that framework and get it adopted by purchasers.
So it's probably fair to say this framework doesn't exist yet, but you expect it to materialize on the 1 year, 3 year, 5 year timeframe?
I think that we should. So we've already sold carbon credits against the future of this existing. And I think the market is supply constrained enough for permanent carbon removal, because we're talking more than 1,000-year permanence, that companies are willing to sort of buy in advance. But I would expect a really sort of a preliminary version in a year and a really solid sort of consensus-driven one within 3 to 4 years.
Maybe I'll jump in. This is Marty. I think the good news is you probably have a couple of investors who are already quite bullish on carbon dioxide removal. And I also think you've seen some real leaders in this space, and you're working with one of them. And so I give a ton of credit to the Shopifys, the Stripes, the Microsofts that have been incredibly public, transparent about what they're looking for. And so the good news is they've largely defined it. The bad news is it currently doesn't include what you're doing, but I'll accept for the moment that they will get there. Where I want to go with my question is, in the venture space, we get nervous about projects and generally prefer to fund scalable tech. If I did the math, and I want to just make sure I understand this, but it's kind of a question of really how scalable is this? And if you're kind of constrained to, I think you said 250,000 tons per year at a given site. If you want to get to a gigaton, if I did the math, that's 4,000 sites, which seems challenging. And related, I'd like to understand how you view permitting. We've seen enormous challenges of anything in ocean, offshore wind, tidal energy, et cetera. So how you think about permitting. So a lot kind of in there, but help me understand how this is a scalable technology and not a one-off project play.
Absolutely, Marty. It's a great question. The way that we see this working is that every deployment is going to be both a combination of product and project. And just very similarly to just about anything out there where there's I come out of software, which is the most scalable thing in the world. The professional services team had to go in and make it work in the enterprise and, deploy the thing. And then the product would come in, and that's where you would monetize and drive things. We want to do something very similar. You can kind of think of our product as a box. It's got an interface to the various different inputs. And then the project is to condition the mine waste that we're using to fit those inputs. And that is, it's a fairly standard process in the metallurgical space to get to there. And that's how we think that we can replicate this. We're not going to get to a gigaton with me owning every piece of capital on my balance sheet. There's absolutely no way that's going to happen. So we're expecting this to go through project financing. We're expecting that we as a company are going to be a technology company, and that fundamentally we're going to be selling the license for this stuff, as it gets deployed around the world. And we deploy this as sort of the package and, some professional services support to do it. Now, is that a scalable software? Of course not, right? This is a chemistry play. This is all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, we think it will be quite a scalable system nonetheless. In terms of the size of site, typically when we're looking at these kinds of sites, the scale of the system is going to go against the lifetime of the resource. And this is sort of, going into metallurgical space. But the pile of rocks, the size of the pile of rocks, you don't want to put in, $200, $300 million of capital in a place and only have it run for a year. So you sort of size that appropriately. And to give you a sense of things, in terms of two of the pilot sites, one that we're actively working on, one that we're investigating now, the one we're actively working has 800 million tons of rock tailings that we can use. And the other one has 400 million tons of rock tailings that we can use. And so you're at a point where if we are doing, 100,000, 200,000, even 1 million tons a year, we still have a relatively long lifetime of that pile of rock within those individual projects. So I think there's a sort of maybe two axes of scalability within these systems. We see that there's a project scalability, which is going to be based on the resource pile. And then there is a product scalability, which is based on how many deployments we can do. And we intend to sort of leverage both, as we go.
One other quick one. I think this should be a quick answer. Presumably your life cycle analysis is dependent on green power at the mine site?
Yes.
And is that universally true? Or are we somewhat then limited to, Quebec or, markets where there's abundant hydro?
So certainly one of my primary pilot sites is in Quebec. That's, absolutely right. And, there's a big pile in Quebec that we're looking at right now. We've got another site which is entirely fueled by hydropower as well. It's not in Quebec. And then we've got another site that's about 75% renewable today that would need some augmentation of on-site renewable in order to make it work. But, one of the bets on our business, if we're going to get to gigaton scale, is wider and wider spread availability of renewable energy. And that's just going to be critical for, I think, any of these kinds of carbon removal plays. All of them need a good source of energy. Obviously taking carbon out of the air is not something that it's not rolling a rock downhill for thermodynamically, right? So we really have to, have that bet that, we're going to have the renewable energy in time. And, we all know it's not going to be evenly distributed, right? So ideal sites are the ones that are going to have the most access to that. Marty, you asked about permitting as well, and I missed that part of the question. When we talk about the ocean outfall piece, we're currently working with two pilot sites that have existing permitted outfalls into the ocean where we don't need any modification to their permits in order to do what we're doing. And we can just slipstream in. So we have no ocean permit issues up to a certain scale. And that certain scale, it's TBD, but it's in probably the tens to hundreds of millions of tons worldwide sort of scale that we can get to without ever asking for a single additional permit. So we're pretty good from that perspective. But it's a process where we've got to do it still. So.
Thanks. And Mike, I love the rock rolling down the hill analogy. I think as an engineer, one of the things that I'm struggling to picture, and I'm hoping you can kind of paint me an image now, is all of this mass moving through the system. So you've got rocks that need to go into an electrolyzer to shove some hydrogens over here and attach some OHs to some minerals over here. And then they're going to be wet, presumably, and then there's a lot of process steps buried in that. And I'd love maybe for just a high level picture of how all this mass is moving, and how do we get over that belief hump for this is going to be really cheap, even though we're moving around a lot of piles of rocks.
Yeah. So I think, and Carly, I don't want to dig too deeply on the public forum and exactly how that process works, unfortunately, but let me say that one of the reasons that we want to site this at the mine is so that we have to do the minimum amount of rock moving. When you sort of look at the ratios of this process, this mild, non-toxic, naturally solid form of alkalinity that we're producing at the other end is in a ratio of roughly, depending on the mineral source, between 2 and 6 to 1 in terms of weight. And so the reason we site the processing facility at the mine site is that if we were to transport the rock, we'd be transporting like 2 to 6 times as much rock as we do alkalinity at the end of the day. So that's a big part of the process. The electrochemical process it's not just an electrochemical process. Obviously, there's a number of process steps, as you mentioned, within the system that are purification, cleanup, and general metallurgical processing steps, with the electrolyzer sort of at the center of the process.
Great. And one follow-on question there. Could you just name your assumptions around cost of CO2 credits? Is it $100 a ton? Is it something different? And what are you aiming for on hydrogen costs for the point at which you're entering the commercial space?
Yeah, so great question. So in generation 1, where we're buying our alkalinity, the price for carbon removal is very high because the incremental amount that we actually remove is quite small, and you have to buy it on the open market. By the time we get out to very high scale, I'm expecting that the blended cost of the process, if you include selling the hydrogen and some of the co-products within the system, will end up that we should be removing carbon for under $100 a ton, if not closer to, it's a little TBD, but it's probably around 75 or less per ton of CO2. And that's based on a huge set of assumptions, one of which is the cost of energy, the cost of our mineral waste product as well. There's sometimes a cost associated with that, the kinds of co-products that we can get out, and obviously the cost of hydrogen. I believe that that's basing it on a $2 per kilogram price of hydrogen rolled into that process economics. Because the process has a lot of inputs and outputs, there are a lot of levers that have to play into exactly how that all pans out.
And real quick, that you're not assuming added benefit of clean fuel standard or low carbon fuel standard in California to sort of goose that? Where is that in or out of that pricing you just described?
No, that's not included. So
okay.
So essentially, like, that's our cost, right? So if we were to get a $200 per ton out of LCFS, or we were to get whatever the Canadian clean fuel standard innovative fuel is, something like 3 something, right? If we were to get that, that would be margin essentially, right? You'd end up having a fair amount of margin on that price per ton.
If you could sort of wave a magic wand that would sort of unleash and really cause this market to scale rapidly, policy, team, tech, what breakthrough needs to happen for this to really take off?
So I think the magic wand we need right now is one of the key things that we're working on, which is this MRV framework for OAE. I think if I could wave magic wand and we could say, here's the rules of the game in terms of carbon removal through ocean alkalinity enhancement, and this is what people can buy against and how we certify it. I mean, I think that would unlock capital. I think it would bring people in. I think it would, create opportunities. We could probably sell another probably 10,000 tons of CO2 removal right now as a pre-buy for leading companies. But if we did that, I think we could start to lock in longer term supply agreements and stuff like that to build projects earlier. So to me, that's the magic wand we're working on right now.
I think that's a pretty compelling note to close on, but I want to give you a couple of minutes to ask the investors some questions too. So do you have any questions for Carly or Marty? Let's turn the table.
Sure. Yeah. I guess the biggest question I have is, seeing all of this activity in the what I'm seeing on the market side of the carbon dioxide removal space. Are you seeing similar activity on the investor side? I mean, in CDR, are you seeing a lot more companies coming in, and are you excited about it right now?
I'll jump in to just say yes, like slamming the table down now, yes, which has been pretty darn exciting for those of us who have been watching the space for a while. It does make things, I think challenging. Just there's so much activity. There's a lot of froth. There's a lot of when are these markets going to develop? What is the timing? There's a lot of hype and also a lot of opportunity. So as an investor, it feels a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose, just like I'm sure it feels for you, Mike.
Yeah, on our end, I'll say similar, which is we're at a bit of a hype curve in this space. We've seen deals that are certainly very early stage get snapped up pretty quick. I think for all of us, we're still, I think, feeling like we're in the first inning of a 9-inning baseball game, and we're a little nervous how this might play out. But I think there's absolutely an appetite there. I do agree with you on that. The MMV, or measuring, monitoring, verification, is an important component, because there is absolutely a high grading occurring of these sort of check the box and they're over in this category. And then there's all the kind of nature-based that, is kind of in a whole different category and is under enormous pressure in my view. So, I think that the timing is great. I can't remember if you said what sort of range of capital you might be needing, but I will say I would be shocked if there wasn't an appetite in the market for it.
And I think just to double click on one thing Marty said, I'm definitely holding my breath for those verification standards to come through, because I think that's one thing that'll help a lot in terms of, I don't want to say calming the market, but focusing the market on things that are important, and also providing a little bit of a safety net for people getting a little ahead of their skis maybe in this space, and investing in some things that maybe will end up being shocker headlines in a year or 2 or 5.
Yeah, for sure. One other question that I have that would be awesome for me is, if you had one tip for me to improve my pitch, what would it be?
Well, I guess Carly, you jumped in first last time. I'll jump in first this time, maybe. I think just because it was just sort of gnawing at the back of my mind was this question on just, is this really a tech or is this a project play? And maybe just spend a little more time explaining what's proprietary, which then makes me, gives me a little more comfort. You're absolutely right. As hard tech investors, this notion of, sort of parent co that then has a number of special purpose vehicles or project finance companies, that's a pretty standard model. But if you don't have proprietary tech in parent co, you generally end up getting kind of squeezed out of project co. And so just understanding that, I think would have been helpful.
Got it.
Yeah, and I think for me, just maybe a little more color on different revenue streams and the magnitude and the timeline, like getting into a couple more numbers on that would be helpful. And definitely for us, the first interaction, the first call is really about, us getting excited, us getting interested. We'll spend a lot more time later on diving into the technical details, just kind of enough to make sure, like, okay, there's something under there that we'll get to talk about later after, we're all comfortable. But that top line story is really important.
Awesome. Thanks.
I'll offer one last comment, which is, don't forget to sell yourself a bit. You've got a great background. I like your story. And so, like, we never heard about you or your other co-founder. And so that always is helpful, especially when it's positive. If you're just some green first timer, maybe not. But in your case, I think you've got a great backstory.
Thanks, Marty. Yeah, I really appreciate this. And thanks for the feedback. That was wonderful.
Why don't we talk a bit about, the pitch? Anything else that you guys wanted to highlight coming out of this, really about the CCUS space generally?
I think it's really important as a CEO to understand the market and what you're pitching into and what the trends are. And so 2 years ago, if Mike had come across our office and was saying, listen, I want to do a big round at a big valuation, we would have laughed and thrown him out. And literally it would have ended almost immediately. It's almost completely flipped 180 now. And I'm not sure I ever heard how much he was asking for, if he was, but if he came in and was asking for anything less than 10 now, I might think that's too small, given just the frothiness we're seeing, the number of investors who are looking to deploy capital. We are seeing technology readiness level 4 deals in this space go on and raise 10, 20, 30 million in a seed round. So,
and just for our listeners, Marty, what does TRL 4 mean? What does that look
technology
like?
readiness level means it's kind of out of the lab, but just barely. There's still sort of, validating components, but they've yet to even prove it as a full system. And so when you're seeing very early stage hard tech raise the sort of funds or capital at the sort of valuations, it's a sign of frothiness. But if you're Mike, again, you got to know what the market is, and when you come in, then sort of position yourself within that. Ask for too little and we lose our interest. Ask for too much, and then you still might get it in this market, but you got to know your sweet spot.
Yeah, that's interesting. Carly, how would you react to that?
Like Marty said, Mike's timing is pretty perfect. Couldn't be better. From our standpoint, it makes me a little bit nervous. And so how that reflects back on the pitch is the more things that Mike can do to make me feel comfortable, the better. And so even just having a very clear structure of that pitch makes me feel like, okay, this person, and obviously Mike's got a great background. He's done this before. That gives me confidence. Some things around naming Shopify as a partner, that's huge, like showing that credibility that somebody has done their homework at least a little bit on the offtake side. I love the solidify the output to outfall license. He used a pun with solidify that I really liked. But also on the flip side, I think that's where most of my questions still is around that mining sector, which is traditionally very conservative, traditionally very hard to move. We're hearing a lot of people talk about that space in like low carbon cement and other mineralization approaches as well. And I know it's also tricky because there's NDAs and there's relationships and you don't want to talk about them in a public sector, but the more that you can address that insecurity that I as an investor have is like, oh, this is a tough industry that we've avoided for a very long time. Maybe not so much Marty, and you guys do a lot of great work in this space, but the more you can address that, the better.
I'll also say, Carly, I think you touched on something that was perfect, which is I always like first principles. And if you're trying to sequester 1 billion tons of CO2, but you have to move 10 billion tons of rock, and I can't remember the exact ratio, but when you start to fathom just how big that is, it starts to be a pretty big energy penalty, which gives me a bit of pause. Like if I was to do due diligence, that would be something I would absolutely want to dig in on and understand. No pun intended there, sorry. And then the second, I need to verify this permitting, because everything I have seen in oceans is there is resistance to, sort of doing anything other than maybe kelp farming these days. But beyond that, folks are very sensitive to what happens. It's ironic. We dump billions of tons of plastics and we don't think twice, but if we want to try to use it as a climate solution, then permitting is challenging. But those are kind of the two concerns I have. It's just how much rock do you have to move, and can you actually site these as easily as it sounds like he thinks they can.
Next week, we'll be back with guest Jeffrey Coles, a patent lawyer with Gowling WLG, who specializes in IP protection. We discuss everything related to IP, from picking the optimal time to develop an IP protection strategy, the recent Sonos legal victory over Google, and what to do if you find yourself in the sights of a patent troll. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
To learn more about Foresight's programs, events, and more, visit us at foresightcac.com or follow us on social at ForesightCAC.